All right, everyone, can everybody hear me? Is everybody on? Move to the main room.
Everybody's on, Fernanda.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We apologize. There were some technical issues for our speaker getting connected, but it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Christopher Fagundes, and he's an associate professor at Rice in the Department of Psychological Sciences, and he's also the leader in one of our work groups. So it's a great pleasure to have you here today, Chris, and we're looking forward to hear your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? I guess there's
I can.
Okay, great. All right. Well, can you remind me exactly how much time you want me to spend before Q&A?
Well, we had like a typical 45 minutes, I guess.
That's how it was planned. Great.
Right, but we are moving. We're a little late, so maybe you might want to cut over maybe 10 minutes or so.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, nice to. I guess I've not even really seen everyone virtually, but knowing there are people on the other side of the internet somewhere watching this talk, it's nice to virtually know you're there. So I wanted to start off by, I guess maybe I should just introduce myself really quickly and what I do. Like was said before, I'm Chris Fagundes. I'm associate professor at Rice, and I do work looking at how, mostly looking at how stressful experiences get under the skin to impact autonomic, neuroendocrine, and immune dysregulation, and then design interventions to try to improve those outcomes. The methods I use, I identify as someone that first and foremost works in psychoneuroimmunology. That being said, neighboring fields, which is embedded in health psychology, behavioral medicine, and but neighboring fields, I do work with fMRI, some with as well. Okay, so, with collaborators. So in the 1960s, there was a major study done to examine what is the most stressful events one can experience across the lifespan. And then what they did is they linked it to serious health problems. And what they found is, number one, consistently death of the spouse. Then you have things like divorce and marital separation. Going to jail is never a good thing. And on it goes. And the thing with the death of a spouse is it's one of those experiences that's fairly ubiquitous. If you look at this list, some of these experiences are and some are not. Some are positive and some are negative. But death of the spouse is a fairly ubiquitous experience. And this is important. It occurs in older adulthood when we're more vulnerable on average. So they found that it was associated with a lot of diseases of older adulthood, with cardiovascular problems being number one. And a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today is focusing in on this. So, in popular culture, whenever you see a magazine or news article bring up the idea of stress and its impact on disease, it always elicits some skepticism. I think much less today than probably 20 years ago, but it always elicits some skepticism. Another question that in the scientific literature, a lot of times what people will ask is, okay, we know there's this link, but is this true for everyone, or are there certain people susceptible to the impact of stressful life events? And prevention, is there anything we can do to prevent before, we know we're all going to experience stressful life events, but is there some way we can, before a stressful life event even occurs, build up our resilience? That's a question I hear a lot. Okay. So one way we've been able to answer the question about whether stress gets under the skin, of course, is through epidemiological data. So there's a lot of work, and you've probably even heard of this, to show that when a spouse dies in older adulthood, the other is more likely to die fairly quickly afterward compared to their sort of age match risk of morbidity and mortality. And, you know, we hear it colloquially, someone died of a broken heart. And we've learned from epidemiology data that there's some truth in that. And I mentioned epidemiology because these are these large studies. I think everybody knows this in this audience, so forgive me if I don't mean to talk down to anyone. These are these large studies with, you know, tens of thousands of people a lot of times, and showing this link. But just showing the link is really the first step. And a lot of times what I do in my research in health psychology and neuroimmunology is take epidemiological data and try to understand why from a biological perspective, right? And what I focus on particularly in a lot of my work is the mechanisms. What are the biological mechanisms underlying why? So in this case, it would be, why on earth is people that lose a spouse, what is happening physiologically to make them more at risk? Okay. So I proposed about 5-6 years ago an R01 that was funded to study this phenomena. And I was actually doing a lot of cancer survivorship research at the time. And the reason why I stumbled upon this literature, to be honest, because a staff member in my lab had stage 4 and died of cancer. And I actually was watching what was happening to her loved ones during this period, and her spouse during this period. And it hit me in a way where I started becoming more and more interested in what was going on, because the other spouse did not die, but you could tell the toll, it aged them so much. So I propose that it probably has something to do with autonomic activity, which I'll describe in more detail below. And this is because of work showing that when we're in a high stress condition, not only do we elicit this fight or flight response where catecholamines are released through the system, speeds up heart rate, increases blood pressure, but we also have a dampening of our parasympathetic nervous system. And there's become a lot of work to show that vaguely mediated heart rate variability, which is basically, for this purpose, you can think of it as the vagus's inhibitory control over the sinoatrial node of the heart's pacemaker, which we know is when you have higher vaguely mediated heart rate variability, you're less likely to have a heart attack and such, for very good reasons. Another mechanism I was very interested in is inflammation. And the final that I haven't investigated as much yet is health behaviors. Okay. So the study outcomes for this study will be depression. That'll be presenting our depression, please interest in depression after bereavement, inflammatory activity, vaguely mediated heart rate variability. Okay, so this is, like I said, an R01 that is just actually ending. We're actually in a no-cost extension. COVID has kind of done what COVID has done to every human subject study. But here is the design. We put people in the lab, right? Plus or minus 3 months after the death of the spouse. And my lab is located in the Bioscience Research Collaborative, Rice University. And they have a blood draw. And then we assess, I put RSA standing for respiratory sinus arrhythmia on this slide, but that's a high frequency form of heart rate variability. I apologize, it would have been clearer if I just called it heart rate variability or HRV. And then we give questionnaires and do some sort of psychosocial assessments. We bring them back into the lab at 4 months after the death. And in this visit, we actually add an experimental stressor. So we want to see if stress reactivity is different between people that are grieving quite a bit or bereaved compared to matched controls. So we bring them in the lab, we put a catheter actually in their arm, it rests for a while, and then we do an experimental stressor to see how profound we have these changes in inflammation because of the stressor, and whether that is more profound for those that are bereaved, and especially those that are really struggling with grief. We bring them back in at 6 months later, and we bring them back in at a year later. We have 160 bereaved, and we also are matching to 160 age-matched controls. I'll present some data that is published on some cross-sectional data right here, the closest part to right after the loss. Here's this takes an army to do this kind of work, as you can imagine. And a lot of, I was actually concerned about how this would go over in this population, recruiting bereaved individuals, because I could think of two plausible hypotheses. One is that they'd be very kind of resistant or almost kind of standoffish when it came to doing a study in the midst of early bereavement. Another hypothesis is that they would appreciate that, you know, all the focus is on the spouse and now someone is worried about their health. Luckily, the latter has been universally true. I can't tell you how many thank you cards and such we have received from this study. And it's just longitude, it's not actually an intervention, although we're planning some interventions right now. Okay, so here's our little flyers. All the findings I'm going to present in the next slides are matched for sex, age, BMI, and education. That's important when you're talking about biological outcomes that you're arguing are due to stress or a psychological state. Okay. So we also, I apologize. So we matched on these, and then we controlled for sleep, comorbidities, physical activity, and a number of other covariates that would be obvious confounds for making an argument that a psychological state is kind of getting under the skin to impact the immune system and the autonomic nervous system. And first, I'll orient you to some findings that bereavement was associated with more depressive symptoms. That's not much of a surprise. So those who were bereaved had higher depressive symptoms about 3 months after the loss than matched comparisons. That you can almost think of this as a manipulation check, although they weren't manipulated experimentally. Now, 16 and above counts or is a clinical cutoff for possible major depressive disorder. So this is actually the cutoff for the diagnosis. And as you can see, the average even well exceeds that at 3 months. Used to be the case where you actually couldn't get a major depression diagnosis in early bereavement because of the argument of, well, you know, it's a natural response. The DSM-5 has actually changed that, and the whole idea of what to do with bereavement is in flux with the DSM-5. Okay, so in accord with our hypothesis, we also demonstrated that those who were bereaved, sure enough, had lower vaguely mediated heart rate variability than the matched comparisons. And the effect was actually profound. There's some work showing sort of that heart rate variability, vaguely mediated heart rate variability, it can actually be a prognostic indicator like telomeres of aging. And there's a calculation on, norm, like what biological age are you versus, actual age. And the bereaved compared to the matched comparisons at time one in our study, 3 months after the loss, almost had a 40-year differential in biological age, which is quite remarkable. I wanted to, actually, I'm going to move over this for the sake of time. This is just explaining in more detail what I was saying in the previous slide about age. Okay, we also found that bereavement, sure enough, was associated with higher levels of inflammation. And what we did for this measure of inflammation, and this is with my collaborators that I need to acknowledge, Colby Heinen in particular, and the neuroimmunology lab at MD Anderson that includes Colby Heinen and Anamika Cavalares and Robert Dancer. So I have a subcontract with them. So what we did here was, this isn't serum levels of inflammation, although we do measure those as well. But this is stimulated. So what you do is you isolate the monocytes and you stimulate with LPS to look at the sort of the pro-inflammatory phenotype, which is much more likely biologically what's going on clinically when you're thinking about things like what's occurring in the heart. Okay. Interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, for those that are have a little more background in this field, were the two cytokines with the largest effect, which is no surprise because we see that stress or IL-6 is really responsive to psychological stress. And so is TNF-alpha, just a little bit less. Okay, now I'm going to present data on just the bereaved because, as we know, bereaved controls, right? But the bereaved individuals, of course, are going to have variability in and of themselves. Not everyone that's bereaved is at this kind of really high risk, and we wanted to understand who was. Okay. Now, before I do that, I want to describe really quickly differences between how psychologists and psychiatrists define grief versus depression. Because there is some overlap, but there's also some differences. Of course, there's an identifiable loss when we're talking about grief. Some of the symptoms are very similar to depression, but one that's different is that self-esteem is usually preserved after the loss, where with depression, low self-esteem is a major kind of component that's most of the time seen in major depressive disorder. So I just wanted to orient you to that, the fact that they're not the same process. Another important difference between grief and depression is in depression, we have something called anhedonia, which is basically the inability to experience positive affect, joy, interest in what you used to love to do. We don't see anhedonia as often with grief. People tend to be able to still experience joy. And there's actually a growing literature to show that a lot of times they inhibit that joy, feeling guilty or feeling that other people will judge them for that, which seems to be problematic for the recovery process. Okay, so I'm going to present data here on 99 bereaved participants. So this is just from the larger study. I'm sorry, this is just from the study I presented before. We're just talking the bereaved here. We adjusted for the same things as last time. And what we found here was when you looked at bereaved individuals that exceeded the cutoff for complicated grief. Now I'll get to what complicated grief is in a second, but just think of it as high grief right now. They had higher levels of interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and interferon gamma, as we would expect. Now, I'll explain in a minute why this is actually so important. But before I do that, let me explain this whole cutoff thing. Complicated grief was a diagnosis in the DSM that is taken out. Now, importantly, you couldn't get the diagnosis until 6 months after the loss when it was in the DSM. So when I say a cutoff here, this is the cutoff, case categorical cutoff for this disorder. But even if the disorder was still in the DSM, remember these individuals were at 3 months after the loss. And I go into the vagaries of this for if my psychiatry colleagues are on are watching this. Okay, now here is why we think this is so important, because if you think about it, you know, on one hand, actually, before I do that, let me just also show, and this is just an example here of, we also had an association between depression and inflammation, as well as grief and inflammation, okay? Just like you would expect. So why is this so novel? Well, if you imagine the scenario where you have all of these bereaved individuals, they all have a higher level of symptomology, depressive symptomology in particular, but negative affect, than you do in the general population. So people have argued in the past, and is a very reasonable argument, that you would have this ceiling effect where you wouldn't have enough variability to be able to predict how people are doing on mood and seeing a relationship with how people are expressing kind of pro-inflammatory cytokine production. But we learned we can. There is still a linear relationship there. So imagine, for example, if you're doing, you know, if down the road we're doing anything clinically with this finding, we would know that, you know, when you ask these kind of mood questions, it is a decent indicator of what's going on under the skin, even among individuals that are getting closer to being quite high up and might have a sort of a ceiling effect. Okay, that's just to show you that if you wanted to imagine for a second, just imagine this plot right here. Imagine we're just talking about the general population, right? Well, the bereaved individuals are like up here, right? In general, and this is just this is a fictitious plot to give the example, that you can see from this plot here as an example that even if we grab just that subset, there's still a linear relationship. Okay. Now, you know, thus far, I'm talking about this pathway where we have sort of this stressor impacting the periphery. And for this study funded by NHLBI, it's impacting the heart. But I want everybody to remember a lot of work. Actually, Robert Dancer, I don't know if he's on this, but Robert Dancer was really one of the founders of kind of the field of, you know, understanding that we also have inflammation crossing the blood-brain barrier and impacting the brain. So there's this feedback loop here where when it impacts the brain, it impacts the sickness behaviors, depressive symptomology, fatigue. Okay. So stressful life events and disease risk, if we were going to back up for a second. Why is it sort of occurring? Why are we seeing it? Well, we talked about some mechanisms, right? Is it true for everyone? Well, let's see if we can predict who among the bereaved are most at risk. Okay. You know, George Bonanno, although hasn't done a lot of biological work, I know him fairly well. He's at Columbia University, and he's really done the groundbreaking work when it comes to psychosocial aspects of bereavement. And this is his book if anybody's interested. And what he's demonstrated is when we talk about grief, we think about it, and I want to orient you to the bottom left-hand graph. We think about, something like a stressful life event like grief. We think about, symptoms starting high and then going lower over time. But that actually isn't the norm. To be honest, there are 4 norms or 4 profiles that people reliably, depending on in a population, will experience when they experience a loss. There's a group of individuals that are highly resilient, and you don't see, besides maybe right after, you don't see a lot of kind of change in kind of functioning. Then you have a group that, as you would expect, those are the ones that start off high and recover. You also have this other group that emerges, and this is the group for those that kind of have any background in psychoanalytic theory might think of, where you have this group where at first, maybe they're repressing, but whatever the reason is, they're not experiencing a lot of disruption in normal function, but then it hits them later. And then you have a group of just chronic kind of disruptions in function that don't go away. We think this group up high is most likely, suffering quite a bit well before any kind of stressful life event, or in this case, the loss occurred. Okay, now for my data, if I take a mean, here's what we find with depression. So I'm just taking a mean here, that's just an average. You can see time 1, as you would expect, people are more depressed and they get less depressed over time, right? Great, fantastic, that's what you would think. But I want to orient you to what happens when I plot every single person. As you can see there, enormous variability that isn't captured at all when you just take the average, right? This is to hone in on it a little more. Oh, sorry, this is for depression. This is also for heart rate variability, same thing, even though these trajectories overall, enormous variability. So the question about, is that true for everyone? Well, there's a lot of variability that we know at the psychosocial level as of now, and we have some evidence that it's at the biological level as well. But we wanted to know if we could predict other aspects of resilience. And what we did is we went back to our research, back to the basic psychological literature on research that kind of showed who is most likely to be resilient in the face of stressors. And lots of work that really dates back to Freud, if you want to even credit him for this insight, is that our early life experiences matter a lot. The idea, if we're in a stable environment, we're getting support and security from our caregivers as a child, we learn that the world's a safe place and we can cope with stressors. In addition, a really safe and nurturing environment helps regulate the system when it's still developing. So we're not in hyperdrive for the rest of our lives when, especially when stressors emerge. Okay. So first, I just wanted to point you to, this is actually an honors thesis student here, the relationship between, so there's no biological data here, what she was interested in is if there's a differential impact on depression, as a function of whether one's bereaved, but also whether they've experienced, this kind of early adversity as a child. And this is a scale on child maltreatment, abuse, neglect. And what she found was actually quite interesting. The bereaved individuals had, you know, higher, I'm sorry, those with low child maltreatment, um, I'm sorry, let me reframe that. Those with high child maltreatment, if they were in a bereaved condition, meaning that they were the ones that experienced the loss of the spouse, they had massive differences in depression comparatively to when they were not in that state. However, it's quite interesting that we don't see that much difference in how people are doing psychologically among those who are low on child maltreatment, which kind of adds to the evidence that these individuals that are low on child maltreatment, even when a stressor occurs, they stay pretty, they stay a lot more stable. You can see well under the cutoff for depression. But it's those that experience the maltreatment at children that are really at risk when a stressor occurs, especially in this case, of course, the death of a spouse. They're the ones that are really at risk of suffering. I kind of already described, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, but if I had more time, I would talk more about sort of the origins of resilience, but it's all about the idea of early experiences with warmth and nurturing. We go here, we like to think about the parent from a psychological perspective as a secure base, and you learn at a very young age that caregivers are available and trustworthy, and therefore you can manage stress, and you're more altruistic, and a lot of positive things by having parents that are really good secure bases. So just moving on for the sake of time. Psychologists like theory, and one theoretical framework that has been used to describe the phenomena of early life experiences impacting people throughout the lifespan in different ways. They've utilized this theory called attachment theory, and just really quickly, it goes something like this. You have this healthy early family environment as a kid, and you have consistent, prompt, warm caregiver, and you develop the sense of emotional security. It gives people confidence they can deal with stress, right? Then you have this troubled early family environment. Maybe the caregiver's inconsistent, neglecting, abusive, whatever it might be. You develop the sense of emotional insecurity, and you suffer these lasting deficits in your ability to cope with stress and regulate emotions. For the purposes, this might be a little more detailed than you all need, but we think about insecurity across two dimensions. So those that are low on anxiety, which is sort of this idea of worrying about being abandoned, and low on avoidance, which just is the idea that individuals who just didn't get that consistent, prompt, warm caregiving, instead of being anxious throughout their lives, are sort of like, screw you, and build a wall between them and the world. If they're low on both, we deem them secure. And security is what we think of as the healthy kind of type of attachment. I'm going to move on here and demonstrate that for the bereavement study, what we found is those that were high on attachment, anxiety in particular, had higher levels of interleukin-6. And this is among the bereaved individuals. So in accord with our hypothesis, it was actually one of the original aims of the R01. We found what we would expect, that individuals that are insecurely attached as adults, these early relationships don't just do worse psychologically, but We see it under the skin with pro-inflammatory cytokine production. Okay. This is more than you need to know, but you can think of people that are high on attachment anxiety as those that are in the right-hand column. Okay. Can we do any kind of preventing? Well, that's where my work, I'm trying to go with more of my work now. I'm very interested in this notion of building resilience through positive psychology techniques. So what positive psychology is, this idea of, the history of psychology historically has been about how do we get people that are really having, depressed or other severe forms of psychopathology, how do we get them up to kind of baseline? But positive psychology takes the notion that, well, can we take people that are baseline and actually improve them, help them thrive? An important aspect of positive psychology is this idea that if we do that, we help them build resilience. I'm very interested in tailoring interventions. I'm a firm believer from the data and from my own kind of experiences that, when it comes to psychological interventions, there's really not a one size fits all. And the more we're able to tailor them to the individual or a type of individual, I think the better off we are. There's actually some work now with modes of psychotherapy to try to predict, this person might be better off in a cognitive behavioral framework, where others might be better off in sort of a psychodynamic framework, or I haven't seen a lot kind of targeting the third wave psychotherapies for those that are familiar yet, but I'm sure that's to come. Right now, we are doing a study with the bereaved individuals in the context of COVID, where we're hooking them up to sensors, and we're assessing their levels of stress and their levels of mood. And what we want to predict here, and this is an add-on to the R01, is not just how bereaved individuals are doing in their daily lives and when they're experiencing stress and how it's getting under the skin, but how that's impacting the risks they take associated with COVID. And we're trying to intervene as a result. So, of course, when you could think of self-regulation like a muscle, the more stress, the more we're experiencing this kind of grief, what ends up happening? Well, our self-regulation goes down, our willpower to kind of stay on the straight and narrow goes down. I don't think I'm not going to go into this in very much detail, but I want to orient you to interventions we're looking at in the future, where we're not just focused on grief, but in the context of bereavement, but how people can move on with their lives. So if you see right in the middle there, you see dual process model, right? And the left-hand side, there's loss-oriented, and the right-hand side, there's restoration-oriented. And the notion is that classically, we have individuals, all the focus has been on grief. But, when you actually talk to people that lose a spouse, a lot of the hardships and stressors they're experiencing in their lives isn't the grief as much as learning to build a life again. Practical things like skills that their partner always did, pay the bills, whatever it is for 40 years, they now have to take over. And what we're trying to do is identify what they're missing and intervene accordingly on those practical things, as well as simply like intervening upon grief. I don't think other work I'm doing is using a lot of these same models is on dementia spousal caregivers and those with Alzheimer's disease. I don't really want to go into it in detail. We have a clinical trial and a observational longitudinal R01 in this context. And what we're doing here, just to give a very kind of quick kind of summary, we're taking what we learned in individuals that are bereaved, and we're applying it in a lot of ways to spousal caregivers. Because what you find among dementia spousal caregivers that have a spouse that's progressively getting worse, they're going through what we call living bereavement or living grief. And it seems that same mechanisms are at play. Once again, I always try to thank and thank again and thank again all my collaborators and co-authors, because it's a thing like that. It's totally a team effort. And then I always make sure, even though they probably don't know it, I highlight my trainees and my staff. I mean, it takes a huge staff to do these kind of things, as you know. And here's my senior staff here. Person on top there's, God, she's been with me now for going on 8 years. And the person in the middle has been here about 6. All right, well, thank you very much. I always like to talk in person, but I always find it a little disoriented, but it's better than nothing, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was very interesting. And I do have a question. However, I see there is an option for the chat, but I guess I can go ahead and ask a question, or maybe 2. So the first question I have is, have you controlled your bereaved with for religious faith, which is usually a typical I guess source of strength and resilience, especially when it comes to grief. And that's one thing. And the second question is very different, is do you know whether the same type of mechanisms of grief in a way and depression like in symptoms appear in animals who actually form long-term couples? I know there are, I think, maybe some small mammals or birds form stable couple throughout their life. So yeah, so 2 completely different questions.
Yeah, but 2 great questions. So I'm going to attack the last one first. Yes, the idea of pair bonding animals going through similar processes biologically has been investigated and is investigated actually before human models mostly. So prairie voles, there's been a lot of work on prairie voles because they're a pair bonding species. Someone named Marian Hofer, published a lot of work in this area where they would, manipulate, to be honest with you, the separation and kind of, experimentally manipulate that grief, and demonstrated what we're finding in, human models way before we found it in humans in animal model work. Lots of work going on now. I was just in a conference funded by mini conference funded by NIA, was it 2 weeks ago, on using animal work in sort of the neuroscience domain to try to understand the neuroscience underlying grief. And going back and forth between the animal model researchers and the human model researchers, there's about half and half at that mini conference. And the animal model researchers, yes, are always using these pair bonding, and I have a lot of respect for them because the models or the type of mouse model that so many use, they're not able to use for their work if they delve into this, right? They need to use a pair bonding one, so they have to invent so many different things and breed so many different lines by scratch that others don't. So I have a lot of respect for those researchers. One thing we do know from a neurological perspective, it seems to be occurring in grief that works differently than what you do with classic depression, is the opioid system is highly impacted by loss in a different way that, or fundamentally different than you see with depression. You know, the natural thing people will say, but you know, this is loaded and I'm not recommending it by any means because that's for someone else to do, is, you know, would a low dose opioid really help with complicated grief? And quite frankly, there is a little work showing in animals and small studies in humans that show, yeah, it works really well. Everybody's always so cautious because they don't want to be the one, you know, recommending something that's going to lead to this, you know, addiction and right now it's so stigmatized, you know, for all the you know, all the not good that opioids have done. Going back to the religious question, yes, we did assess that. Religion's tough for psychologists for a couple reasons. One is, you know, religion's even within like a predominant, like a Christian, you know, community, they manifest differently. That some churches are much more socially kind of integrated on a weekly basis than others. But that being said, we did just do, I had a postdoc in my lab very interested in this, comes from a Latinx Catholic upbringing, very interested. And what we did is we took all the individuals basically that were attending religious services on a regular basis and reported, you know, high levels of religiosity. And yes, sure enough, they did, they had less immune dysregulation in addition to just less depression than those that didn't have that religiosity. You know, we published it, you know, psychology and religion have a funny history to it. So it's always hard to get in a real top journal. We did get in an APA journal, which is good. But I was really hoping it would make even a bigger splash, but it's tough with religiosity. But yes, to answer your question, yes, and that's published. And I think it's very important. I have a student following up on that right now, an honors thesis student doing her, you know, Rice honors thesis on that very subject too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Should I be looking at the chat?
Yeah, Chris, please. It looks like we've got another one from Melia Bonomo. Do you see that one?
Yeah, so she works in my lab. So let's see. But I haven't seen her in a while because she's launched off to a postdoc on a different floor and she is missed. Hi, Chris, great talk. For the relationship between bereavement, depression, and child maltreatment, was that for a particular time point? Have you looked at trajectories? Great question, Malia. Malia knows the study in and out. So what we demonstrated there was, you know, that publication was on the time point of 3 months after loss. We have actually under review right now, longitudinal data with all 4 time points showing that early abuse neglect is associated with differences in trajectories over time. That's under review right now. That's line of work for my grad student, Michelle Chen, did her kind of her master's on, you know, on how this impacts things over time. So yes, and it behaves like you would expect, with some moderating caveats, which I won't go into. Meaning there are some protective factors, even those with really difficult childhoods.
Great, thank you.
Well, Chris, I'm not seeing any other questions. We'll open it up to one more time to folks. If you'd like to enter something into the chat or you would like to just unmute your mic, we have a minute or 2 left. Yeah, I just encourage you to unmute your mic if you'd like to do so, or you can just enter it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and in the meantime, we'll watch it for a second. But I do thank you, Chris. Very, very interesting talk. And
thank you.
Appreciate you kind of kicking off this seminar series for us. We're excited. Yep. Did you get a chance to say anything about the work group?
Yes. Yeah, so yeah, if I could, if you don't mind if I plug
absolutely.
it. I'm the head of the health psychology and behavioral medicine work group here. And, the goal is to basically bring scholars together that are interested in, behavioral medicine in the Houston area. So behavioral medicine is a broad term. Basically, any type of behavior that, can be applied to these kind of physical or mental health diseases. So it's not limited to psychologists and psychiatrists. To tell you the honest truth, there's people that are immunologists, there's people that are, physicians in stroke. It kind of runs the gamut. So if you're interested, please email me.
Yeah, I actually have another question, Chris, relative to your talk. So at some point you show an IL-6 and TNF-alpha measurement correlating with, I think, depression or grief or both. I don't remember. Are those measured from the circulating from blood, or how were these value? Where did you get these value from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So everything that was shown today was taken. Yeah, you take the blood, and then what you do with the PBMCs is you get, you isolate the monocyte macrophages, and you stimulate them with LPS, and you look at the pro-inflammatory response. So you're actually seeing what happens in the, the cell in the response versus just, serum in the periphery. We also, though, do definitely have data on serum as well. I didn't present it today because it's not published, but I guess I'll talk about it. What we found for serum is quite interesting. So real briefly, I talked about the idea of this experimental stressor where you put the catheter in their arm and then you wait 30 minutes. And then what you do is, you take their blood, and then what you do is you do this experimental stressor, and they have a catheter in their arm after for 2 hours. And the goal of that to see if the inflammatory response differs depending on, in our case, levels of grief. And sure enough, in serum, we found that the IL-6 response looks very, very different among those that kind of exceeded that cut point of grief compared to those that did not. The interesting part, my past work and some others have shown that same pattern with depression and depressive symptoms. When we adjust for depression statistically, it still works. So it's something about grief that even has unique variability over and above depressive symptomology.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. Thank you, Fernanda and Chris. We really appreciate it. For those of you, if you missed anything or you talk to somebody that says, man, I really wish I would have seen that, it will be posted on the Mental Health Research website in about a week. So thanks again to everyone, especially Chris. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye, Chris. Bye-bye, Suzanne.
Bye.